Good morning, everybody. My name is Kurt Hackemer. I am the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of South Dakota. And on behalf of President Sheila Gestring, I bring you greetings. It's exciting to see all of you here this morning. USD, of course, is the home of the Middle West Review for the last several years, and we are very proud to be associated with today's conference on the Lost Region Recovery Project. I remember being in Buckster's Lounge in Hudson, Wisconsin at the 2013 Northern Great Plains History Conference with a room full of scholars who were interested in formalizing the study of Midwestern history. It was an exciting moment. In retrospect, John, we probably should have done it in a supper club. But nonetheless, 1 year later, the Midwestern History Association was formed right here in Sioux Falls. And that nascent idea of about, I think it was 30 of us in the bar, which also seems appropriate, that nascent idea certainly took form. As I look at the bookshelves in my office and the program for today's conference, it amazes me what's happened in the intervening decade or so. Scholars who were already working in the field found common cause with each other. Scholars who might not have thought about the Midwest as a subject are now engaged in that. We are reading each other's work, reacting to each other's questions, and figuring out where Midwestern history fits into the larger framework. And I think what we're finding, which I'm sure will be reinforced today, is that the deliberate study of Midwestern history not only shines a light on an underappreciated part of the American story, but also provides needed nuance to that story. America is a wonderfully complicated place, and the more we learn about regional history, the more we learn about the country as a whole. So I'm delighted to be on that journey with you. I spend my time, when I can, away from administration, hanging out in the late 19th century, working on Civil War veterans in the Northern Plains. And so I'm pleased to sit here and enjoy this with all of you. And I can't wait to see where this field is going to be in another dozen years in the future. So enjoy the conference. May we all be challenged to leave here just aching to do a bit more. And let's settle in and enjoy. So welcome to Sioux Falls. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There is a void at the center of American history. It is a gap where 70 million people should be, where an entire region should be, where the American Midwest should be. This lost region is why we are gathered here this morning in Sioux Falls. Our aim is to revive the study of this place and put it back on the map, on the literal map in some cases, as we'll hear from our geographers here today. You would never teach a course on the history of World War II and completely leave out the Russian front or not mention the Russian front. And you should never teach a class on American history and leave out the American Midwest, which was the biggest region in the country at the at the turn of the century. Today we are gathered in downtown Sioux Falls, which was the location of the 1900 Populist Convention, which took place in a big tent not too far from here on Main Street of Sioux Falls. Locals provided cots to the attendees, many of which were hardscrabble farmers from around the Midwest. I mention this because this movement to revive Midwestern studies is occurring organically, mostly led by people in the region who care about its history and its legacy and its heritage. And the populist nature of this revival, I think, is underscored by Kurt mentioning that it all started in Buckster's Lounge in a small town in Wisconsin. That makes the point very well. All this is to say that this movement is not being driven by Harvard or the New York Times or institutions such as that, but by local people trying to come together in good faith to advance a noble cause. I mention our location in Sioux Falls because understanding place and how it shapes our lives is essential to the study of regions. We are meeting near the banks of the Big Sioux River and the meeting point of the states of Iowa, Minnesota, and South Dakota. Many of you came here via the Loess Hills or crossed over the Missouri River or through the prairies of western Minnesota to arrive. And we want to recognize these places and these features as we study and attempt to revive the study of American regions, especially the Midwest. Finally, let me thank our sponsors, the Journal Middle West Review, the University of South Dakota. We couldn't do this without the leadership of Provost Kurt Hackemer and President Sheila Gestring, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, who gave us a significant grant to pull off this conference. And lastly, I want to thank the Washington Pavilion, who's provided this amazing space for us today so that we can record these sessions properly. C-SPAN is in the house today. They are taping the sessions of this conference, and they will run at a later time on the C-SPAN network. To assess how the Midwest fell off the American map, let us turn to our first speaker, Kristan Cockerill, who will talk to us about the rise of the idea of flyover country. Kristan's roots lie in eastern Iowa and western Illinois. She was born in Ottumwa, Iowa, and moved to the Quad Cities as a youngster. Her summers were spent at Lake Odessa in Wapello, a town in eastern Iowa. She earned her degrees from the University of Illinois and wrote a dissertation on the Mississippi River. Kristan is currently a professor at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, where she proudly wears her many Midwest Themes t-shirts. Please welcome Kristan.
All right, good morning. Let's see if I can make this work. All right, I want to give a broad overview of the idea of flyover, both its roots and its evolution, which are deeply embedded in sort of the intersections among settlement, transportation, entertainment, and politics, and are also very tightly linked to both geography, physical place, and more recently, much broader cultural ideas. So let's start with settlement. The roots of what we now call flyover are at the very beginning of the nation. One of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence was that the king and parliament prohibited settlement into the Ohio Valley. This created a very early sense of resentment and a very early idea that the East had a bias against those who wanted to shift further into the interior. As the Ohio Valley was settled, there was an expectation of the new government, the U.S. government, that they would provide protection against Indian attack and that they would provide infrastructure, canals, roads, bridges, etc. And when those expectations weren't met, that sense of resentment and that sense that there was an Eastern prejudice against those who were moving into the western part of the new country just got deeper. And of course, lots of folks emigrated from the Ohio Valley into what is now the upper Midwest. And as they emigrated, they carried that resentment and that Eastern prejudice with them. And this really becomes manifest in debates and discussions about transportation in what is now the middle part of the country. Initially, water transportation was crucial for moving people and goods around. And there, again, were expectations that the government would provide support for the infrastructure needed to make sure that transportation could happen. And when those expectations weren't met, that sense of resentment just got further entrenched, and the Eastern bias, frankly, became much stronger. This gets exacerbated as the railroads come online. There's tension and competition between those who want waterway navigation and those who support the railroads. There's a lot of rhetoric coming out of the Midwest that the railroads are simply an Eastern greedy monopoly who are dominating the national conversation at the expense of those in the Midwest. As the railroads move to the far west, you also see the perceived attention being granted to the far west, again, ignoring the Midwest. And we actually see this in settlement patterns. Oops, that went one too far. So obviously Illinois and Missouri become states relatively early, But California becomes a state not long after Iowa and Wisconsin and before Minnesota. So we see this pattern repeated of the Midwest and the Far West being settled, being granted statehood at the same time. But federal infrastructure support specifically for irrigation takes precedence over what those in the Midwest felt they wanted, which was continued water navigation. So you get irrigation, you get the Bureau of Reclamation in 1902 in the far west that allowed agriculture to happen further west with negative consequences for the Midwest. Again, they're still clamoring for river navigation, which for the Mississippi doesn't happen until 1907. So you've got this gap, you've got this deepening entrenchment of the idea that now both coasts are functioning against the middle of the country. And we see this continue as highways come online. John Steinbeck has a great quote that once the highways were done, you'd be able to travel from New York to California and not see a single thing, sort of foreshadowing this what we now call flyover. And of course, then you do get, by early 20th century, you get air travel, commercial air travel. And you get the phrase flyover that initially just literally means, as you go from point A to point B, what's the flyover pattern? But it quickly develops via the entertainment industry into what we now call flyover country or flyover states. As pop culture and the entertainment industry become well established in New York and California, a lot of the pop culture, TV shows, for example, get centered there, but it's also about the idea that the executives are flying between these two poles and ignoring what's happening in the middle. The flyover country, right, we all know, it's literally what you see from 30,000 feet as you fly over. One TV executive purportedly said, you know, it's the public down there, that's flyover. And initially, this definitely did have a pejorative connotation, but as scholars really started digging into where it came from and how it was used, what they found was that references to flyover country, references to flyover states, emanated mostly from the Midwest. It was this interesting refraction of us talking, I still think of myself as a Midwesterner, it's us talking about ourselves via stereotypes that we perceive others have about us. And so I find this fascinating because, again, it's the negativity, at least then, isn't coming from the coast toward the middle. It's the middle talking about itself. And this clearly reflects some sense of identity, perhaps a sense of inferiority. And I would argue that this is the culmination of, again, literally more than a century of this perceived neglect, this prejudice, this sense that it's the coast against us. And this became embedded very deeply in the Midwestern psyche. And so when we actually get the phrase, we in the Midwest start seeing it as this sense that there are places that matter and places that don't, as Tony Harkins has written. And then by association, that means there are people who matter and people who don't. And that the idea that somehow what's important, what is good, is somewhere else. And there are multiple memoirs written by people from the Midwest, who grew up in the Midwest and then moved away, where they explicitly say this. They felt growing up that the real world was out there. It was somewhere else, not where they were. And this is really the notion of how we see flyover country today, at least in the academy, is it's a much broader concept. It has shifted from being necessarily about a particular place and more about the dichotomies among places and the people who live there, urban, rural, rich, poor, red, blue. And there's a listserv called airliners.net, which is for commercial pilots. And in 2018, they had a thread called, "Is Midwest Really Flyover?" And it frankly traces this history of the flyover idea. It starts literally with airports. Where are airports and how do you get from one place to another? And it very quickly developed into a broader cultural discussion, with one pilot saying, "I tell most international visitors that the middle of the country is the armpit of the country. Nothing to see there." Lots of back and forth about that one. The term flyover country was popularized by people living in the country's interior who felt that the coast had too much control. It had nothing to do with the interior being boring. And finally, one pilot wrote, "Flyover country is a political term referring to the elite wealth, politicians, and media that live on the east and west coast and have no understanding and disdain for real Americans." And this is what's happened, right? This is the idea of flyover country, flyover states has become very political. And again, it has less focus on the Midwest as a region and more on these dichotomous conditions or perceived dichotomous conditions. So we've got multiple books that use the term flyover country and don't actually define that, and they're not about the Midwest per se, they're mostly about the urban-rural divide and the economic divides. And then it definitely has been co-opted for political use, especially during election cycles, with stereotypes about, again, mostly rural, poor, that they're white, heterosexual, Christian, and totally glossing over the diversity of the region, glossing over the history of the region. And this is sort of, I think, where a lot of us now often see or interpret that when people say flyover, they're talking about us in the Midwest, and they're using it in this very negative way. But what I'm also seeing is a reappropriation. The term has become malleable, the term has become malleable and able to be interpreted in many ways. And in the Midwest, I think there is now a sense of saying, no, we are going to refute, we're going to reject, and we are going to actively use this terminology to say this is not who we are. And I loved this spread from Midwest Living in 2021. It says, flyover country. To that tired insult, we say, take a look down at what you're missing. And this great aerial spread showing the urban centers, the cultural centers, the environment, the rural areas. And you also had Nebraska. Anybody here from Nebraska? The Nebraska Tourism Board had an amazing advertising campaign in 2022 and 2023 that really leaned into the flyover notion to say, no, right, yeah, we have flyover and it's amazing, right? So I see this as optimistic and I think, again, just in the long history of thinking about flyover, I think people now are like, no, we're going to take this back. We're going to own it. The other thing I see happening is in the Midwest, a shift to just saying, let's talk about the Midwest and not even invoke the flyover. Let's just not go there because it has become so politicized, because it has become stereotypical in many negative ways. And so if you go online, right, you can find all kinds of literally stuff for the Midwest. You can find vacation plans, companies that are just doing vacation planning to send people to the Midwest. And I think for us, for our purpose here, this is important because the idea of flyover came out in many ways, came out of pop culture. And I think we have to pay attention to what pop culture is doing now. We have to pay attention to how the marketplace is couching this. Because to me, this signals that there are a lot of people who are embracing this more positive view, this sometimes quirky, funny view that lets you in on, right, you have the inside track, you get the inside jokes if you look at what they've got, if you're from the Midwest or you live here. And I think there's power in that. And I think if we all, again, most of us are academics, if we don't pay attention to that, I think we're missing something that we could leverage to help us in thinking about how to reframe how we study the Midwest. And I'll leave it there except to show a few of my favorite Midwestern shirts. I didn't realize how many of my t-shirts are either from places in the Midwest or about the Midwest until I was working on this talk. So clearly, my pride, even I left 30 years ago, but my pride is still very strong, and I tell anyone who will listen all about the Midwest. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristan. When you started talking about the Nebraska advertising campaign, I thought for sure you were going to talk about their recent advertising campaign that was entitled Nebraska, It's Not for Everyone. And that was run by the state of Nebraska. Well, thank you, Kristan. Our next speaker is Jeff Bremer, who is a professor of history at Iowa State University. He is the author of a brand new history of the state of Iowa, published by Kansas University Press. It is a comprehensive book from the last ice age until the end of 2020. So Iowa's our next door neighbor. Be sure to check out his book. He is currently working on a history of the city of Des Moines, and his next book after that will be a Civil War history of Iowa. And I'm proud to say that Jeff is also a member of the Board of Editors at Middle West Review. So please welcome Jeff.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank all of you for showing up. It's a Saturday morning. There are better things to do in the world than to come to listen to people like me, but I appreciate it. I'm from California, and California is not for everyone. So I'm not from Midwest, but I'm fortunate to be here. And I'm giving this talk today, which on the face of it, it seems to be kind of a downbeat, grim topic. And it is, but I'll try to find what humor where I can. The historical profession in the Midwest is in decline, to state the obvious, just as it is nationwide. The number of history majors is down by about half since the Great Recession. Students have abandoned history as a major more than any other. However, history has been one of the most popular majors at Yale. Many of those at the Ivy Leagues choose history as their major, while not encouraging the rest of us to do so. There are many reasons for this decline, ranging from students who seek a high return on their college investment to the fact that most colleges don't require a history class for graduation. Colleges also invest in STEM fields, even as states reduce their financial support for higher education. And as we all know, the population of the Midwest is falling, reducing the pool of potential applicants. We face an increasingly bleak future as schools shut down, departments close, enrollment falls, colleges prioritize science and technology, and a presidential administration that is different from any other. This is a list of schools that have closed in our region in the past 5 years. Schools and departments have been closing at an increasing pace in the 2020s. More than 20 colleges shut down in the Midwest between 2020 and 2025. Most of them were smaller private ones, such as Northland College in Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin system shut down a whole bunch of their two-year schools. And a community college in Ohio collapsed and shuttered. Loss of smaller schools that served local populations reduced opportunities for those who lived in rural areas. The end of humanities programs also reduced opportunities for students. History departments, both large and small, have been shrinking. Large flagship universities in places like Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois have lost about 1/3 of their tenured faculty. Smaller schools like the University of Missouri in Kansas City, the University of North Dakota, and the University of Cincinnati have lost about 1/2 of their history faculty. Some colleges have gone much further. Missouri Western State University eliminated their history, English, economics, and political science programs in the early 2020s, firing 1/3 of their faculty. Monmouth County in Illinois will shut down its history department in 2026. Supposedly, they will still have history classes, but there will be no history major. Last time I checked, the only person there was an adjunct. They also shut down philosophy, anthropology, and Spanish departments. Monmouth will invest in growing programs in business, nursing, and data science. But the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point scrapped plans to cut their history and other liberal arts majors when it faced backlash in the state. Higher education in the Midwest and nationwide is undergoing consolidation. Students are focusing on majors they hope will get them high-paying jobs. They're also heading to larger flagship and land-grant universities. Departments contracted because there were fewer students taking history classes and less demand for those classes. At the University of Wisconsin, computer science and economics were the most popular majors. The number of computer science majors grew by more than 600%. Some today may be wishing they had studied the humanities, as AI is helping to eliminate many entry-level programming jobs. The number of economics majors at Wisconsin almost doubled in the 2010s. Those pursuing science, technology, engineering, and math grew greatly as well. From 2007 to 2022, the total number of bachelor's degrees awarded at the University of Wisconsin grew by 30%. But the number of history degrees awarded fell by 61%. The economic uncertainty and the cost of college drove students into higher paying majors that provided economic security. Median earnings for degrees in computer science were almost double those of degrees from the humanities. It did not help that many people viewed the humanities as unprestigious majors. Support for writing and research is also declining. Journals are endangered, including my own home state's Annals of Iowa and Ohio History. University presses are in trouble. The University of Missouri Press and University of Kansas Press barely survived being shut down in recent years. University Press of Kansas is one of the most important university presses in the region. You see up here, these are 4 books out of 6 published by University Press of Kansas, just from historians in my department. Kansas Press publishes many books in Kansas and the region, and important series on legal history, military history, and political history. Iowa State University Press closed almost 20 years ago. That press had published dozens of things that I used in research on my book, modestly placed on the bottom right here. As a number of historians in the Midwest shrink, the number of us studying the region will fall. Fewer professors in the Midwest will also mean fewer students studying the Midwest. Number of students admitted to many grad schools in the region is down by at least half. At Wisconsin, which had 600 graduate students in the 1990s, only 15 were admitted in 2024. We will know less about ourselves in the future. In Pamela Riney-Kerberg's words, the number of stories that are written shrinks. Many possibilities are on the verge of extinction. Pam wrote about the story of an Alaskan resident who sent a box of letters on the KKK to Iowa State University professor Dorothy Schweiter, because he knew that someone at ISU studied Iowa. The collection of letters became a key part of the story of the Klan in Iowa in the 1920s. And you see here a Klan pamphlet saying, "Everybody welcome," at the very bottom, which is not what you'd expect from the KKK. Many of the key works that I used in my book came from professors at Iowa or those at ISU, such as the article that Dorothy Schweiter wrote on the Klan, about the only thing that we have recently on the organization. Professors studied the region they live in. Their graduate students followed in their footsteps. Alan Bogue at Wisconsin trained my colleague Pamela Riney-Kerberg at ISU, who trained Sarah Egge, who's written on Midwestern history. She's at Center College. Douglas Hurt trained Megan Burke, who was once president of this organization. Ellis Hawley from University of Iowa trained John Lauck. Iowa's an example of many of the trends that plague the history profession. State government has chosen to no longer support the publication of Iowa's historical journal, the Annals of Iowa, despite the fact that it paid for itself through subscription revenue. There might be positive news about the Annals coming up in the next few months, though. At Iowa State University, the MA and PhD programs in history have been closed. Those were focused on rural, agricultural, and environmental history, especially on the Midwest. Iowa's also chosen to close one of 2 research centers at the State Historical Society. The branch in Iowa City is scheduled to be shut down in 2026, an archive where I spent months doing work on my book and am furiously looking for material on my next couple books. At the last report, the state planned to move 40% of its records to the other branch in Des Moines, though a court case has stalled that process. The state has assured the public nothing will be thrown out or lost. We hope that is true. Despite all the bad news, history is eagerly consumed by the American public. The History Channel is popular, though some of its most watched shows, like Ice Road Truckers, Pawn Stars, and Ancient Aliens, have dubious connections to the academic subject that we all study. But of course, at least public media is thriving. PBS's American Experience has run for decades, with episodes on everything from presidents and wars to sports and civil rights. Ken Burns is eternally popular, and his 6-part series on the American Revolution begins, I think, next week. And some of the most popular podcasts are about history, though they aren't usually by we academics. And they often focus on the British Empire, Roman Empire, somebody's empire, and have titles like Hardcore History, or as you see up here, History That Doesn't Suck. What should tell you what, most people think about how we teach history. Books on the Civil War and books on presidents still sell. Though, anyone want to guess who the best-selling historian in the country is? It's Bill O'Reilly. History is culturally important in ways you wouldn't have expected 10 years ago. It's important in debates about what can be taught that are at the forefront of the national conversation. What should be taught in K-12 schools? What should we teach in college? What should be at a display in the Smithsonian or on a plaque in a national park? So, that title seems unusual, oddly optimistic. So there we have it. It's a grim summary, but not everything is awful. Plenty of great books on the region continue to be published. The Middle West Review is thriving, full of articles on topics from politics to art to the environment. Conferences like this are still being held. Journals in the region hang on. The contraction in the number of history majors seems to have bottomed out. Artificial intelligence may make computer science a less attractive field of study. So there's hope, good ideas abound, and many of which we will hear about today. Thank you.
Jeff's presentation can be a bit of a downer, but he did mention Dorothy Schweder, who I want to highlight just for one moment. Dorothy Schweder taught at Iowa State University for many decades, and she's a South Dakotan. She's from Presho, and any West River folk here want to read a great book about West River, South Dakota. Read Dorothy Schweder's book, Growing Up with the Town, about how she grew up in Presho. Our next speaker is Chris Laingen, who's a professor of geography at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois. He grew up on a typical Midwestern farm in southwestern Minnesota, surrounded by corn, soybeans, and hogs. And I would note for any of the Scandinavians in the audience that Chris grew up next to the small Minnesota town of Odin, which is about as Norwegian as it gets. He studied geography at South Dakota State University in Brookings, where he fell in love with the study of the land and geography, and went on to get a PhD in geography at Kansas State University, which had one of the very few PhD programs that focused on rural geography. Chris was present at the creation in 2015 when we had our first conference about attempting to revive Midwestern history in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That led to a book in which he has a chapter called Finding the New Midwestern History, published by University of Nebraska Press. I'm happy to work with Chris. Probably we exchange 50 emails a week. He is on the board and an editor at Middle West Review and does amazing work there. So please welcome Chris.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, John, for inviting us all. And I did bring lefse for tonight for after dinner, so if you don't know what it is, just ask a neighbor and probably know. All right, the title of my talk today is The Death of Midwestern Geography, but as we'll soon see, it could have easily been titled The Death of Regional Geography. Most people think geography is simply knowing where countries are, or capitals, or rivers, or mountains, and that's part of it, and an important foundation, but it's like saying math is only about knowing numbers. What geography truly is the study of diverse environments, places, and spaces on the Earth's surface and their interactions. It examines the characteristics of places, including their natural environmental settings and people, along with the relations between the two. But more importantly, geography is about interactions, processes, spatial relationships, and most importantly, is focused on mapping and spatial analysis. So if historians focus on the when, geographers focus on the where. One of my favorite definitions of geography came from a former professor of mine at South Dakota State, Charles Fritz Gritzner, who once framed geography as a series of three simple questions. What is where, why is it there, and why should we care? And if you're asking those questions in that general order, you're doing geography. In the 1960s, William Pattison explored what he called geography's four traditions. The first is the spatial tradition, which is essentially concepts like distance, form, direction, and position. The man-land tradition focuses on human geography. The earth science tradition deals with physical geography. But the fourth, area studies, first discussed by Strabo around 7 BC, deals with the nature of places, their character, how they differ from one another. In other words, regional geography. Over time, geographers have increasingly specialized in various systematic subdisciplines, many of which have an affiliation with academic programs found on most college campuses. But when you connect the bits and pieces of these subfields together, another type of geography, regional geography, comes into focus. Former University of Minnesota geographer John Fraser Hart, in his 1982 Association of American Geographers presidential address, the highest form of the geographer's art, said that the purpose of regional geography is to understand areas, not merely to draw lines around them. Unlike other disciplines, geographers are interested in the totality of places, and we need to see how apparently disparate things fit together in the real world. So if this diagram represents all the various facts and data points about somewhere, important but not terribly interesting, geography, and regional geography specifically, focuses on the science and the art that helps us construct a deeper understanding and appreciation of places. However, regional geography is difficult to practice. As SDSU geographer Daryl Napton said in a recent Middle West Review issue, he explains that it requires a lengthy startup time to develop regional understanding and to become familiar with everything that's needed that's helped shape the region. Most geographically minded people have an innate ability to see complex patterns emerge at multiple spatial and temporal scales of interaction. And I think this starts developing at a young age. I was fortunate enough as a young boy in the 1980s to have a grandfather with one of these, a Pontiac Safari station wagon, which meant that most of my time was spent back here, facing backwards and watching the world whiz by me, much like the tail gunner of a B-17, but I loved it and I was always the navigator on family trips. Whereas kids today, barely look out the window. I think we all know how bad people's geographic knowledge has gotten. In a recent survey of Americans and Europeans, just over 50% could locate North Korea on a map. In a dark way, it's all kind of amusing until you see a student in your own class who's lived in Illinois their entire life not only score very poorly on a U.S. state quiz, but also write Chicago for the state in which they live. All told, this score for this 50-point quiz across 100 students, all EIU undergraduates, was a worrisome 26 out of 50. A score not all that different from what National Geographic found in their own survey in 2016 of what college-age students know about the world. You see, this slow disintegration of geographic knowledge is starting at the K-12 level, where only a few states, those in shades of blue and green, at least as of 2013, require geography be taught at the middle or high school level, like South Dakota, where others, like Illinois, leave it up to local school districts. Like the ongoing history crisis covered recently in Middle West Review, university geography programs may also be entering a time of crisis. Looking at the number of geography degrees awarded in the U.S. since the 1940s, we see a growth of the discipline into the 1960s, followed by a slight decline. The early 90s saw another slight increase before leveling off in the 2000s to between 4,000 and 5,000. If we zoom in to more recent decades, we see a drop in degrees awarded that started around 2012, a decline that has continued, with the most recent data showing just over 3,700 degrees awarded in 2023, with no end of the decline in sight. These data include geography degrees, but also those from other geography-adjacent program types, such as GIS and cartography, as well as geography and other names like environmental studies. In 2017, 2 Oklahoma State geographers surveyed these name-changing trends that are happening, largely to combat geography's longtime legitimacy crisis. Since the 1980s, more and more departments have been attempting to rename and rebrand themselves. Dozens of departments changed their names from Department of Geography to something else. The most common changes included 19 that dropped the name geography completely, 10 merged with geology, 10 changed to emphasize STEM components, and another 20 added the word environment to their name. Reasons given for these changes were largely cosmetic, enhancing the department's off-campus prestige, attracting more undergraduate majors, and enhancing the department's on-campus standing. But the largest category of other included budgetary, administrative, and changing field rationales, such as dean's decision at the request of administration and to align with naming practices of other departments. And we can see these changes all across the Midwest, in Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Michigan, and Oklahoma. Famously, departments from Harvard to Princeton to Stanford have altogether removed geography from their campuses. The University of Michigan closed its doors in 1982, citing a grueling review process that saw the discipline's necessity very publicly called into question. Administrators in a campus newspaper story said, "We believe that the department is vulnerable because it is not as coherent or as essential as many others, and that the department's practitioners were primarily the type of regional geographer that's become associated with area studies programs of the post-war period." University of Chicago dropped its program in 1987, and in 1985, Northwestern closed its doors, although it continued to have a program in geography, a minor, until 2024, when the last geographer, John Hudson, after 53 years, retired. Our largest professional organization, the Association of American Geographers, or AAG, started in 1904 at a small conference in Philadelphia. For decades, membership was slim, but like undergraduate degree trends, membership grew steeply in the 60s, peaked in 2017, and has since dropped to just over 9,000. Each year at the annual conference, AAG presidents give their presidential lectures, which are later published in the organization's flagship journal, the Annals of the AAG. To get a sense of how these elected leaders have changed their messages, who theoretically share similar worldviews and perspectives of many in the electorate, I did a quick survey of their lectures from 1940 to 2024. Broadly speaking, lectures fell into 2 categories: those that focus on core geographic concepts, which are shown in black, and those that are more general social commentaries, which are shown in green. In the 1940s, 9 of the 10 dealt with basic geographic topics like historical geography, urban geography, land use, and so on. Only one, Problems of Our Time, dealt with how the discipline should adapt in the post-World War II time period. The next 5 decades were much the same. Most lectures dealt with standard, straightforward geographic topics that anyone could easily connect to the discipline. But in 2004, a noticeable shift emerged, specifically with Alec Murphy's lecture, Enhancing Geography's Role in Public Debate. This continued into the 2010s, where presidents increasingly pursued topics related to human rights, civil rights, race, and gender. And in our most recent decade, lectures focused on equity, reciprocal scholarship, justice, and inclusion. Such topics, especially for those of us in academia, are commonplace. But it seems that the leadership of the world's largest organization of geographers has become less focused on geography and more focused on advancing socio-political ideologies. Because of this, many geographers have taken their publications and membership dues elsewhere. Similar approaches also appear more frequently in academic articles. This one from Geohumanities, which is published by the AAG, claims that pumpkins are a marker of white privilege. Another from Progress in Human Geography states that merging feminist post-colonial science studies and feminist political ecology frameworks leads to more just and equitable science and human-ice interaction. Okay, but shouldn't we just understand how glaciers work? And maybe most famously, a group of non-geographers published fabricated research in several academic journals as part of their larger grievance studies projects, where they exposed, very successfully, the increasingly flimsy nature of academic publishing. One of their papers, positing that dog humping at urban dog parks in Portland was emblematic of rape culture, was named the best paper of 2019 in Gender, Place, and Culture, the leading academic journal on feminist geography, until their project was exposed and papers were retracted. Such articles are becoming increasingly common, exacerbated by the immense growth and specialization of academic journals, all part of the longer ongoing trend of geography losing its wear. Even more troubling, 3 years ago, 2 Central Washington geographers analyzed 67 years' worth of annals articles in search of geography's most important tool, maps. Fluctuations in map usage tracks with various eras, as you can see in the chart, where new and emerging subspecialties in geography were all the rage. Some used more maps, some used fewer. But what's troubling is the very recent decline that began around 2000, considering it's never been easier for geographers to make maps. All told, articles with analysis maps have been decreasing decade by decade, from over 70% in the 1950s to less than 40% today. Many geographers whose work is highly specialized and esoteric can no longer see the forest for the trees. Although our modern academic industrial complex is focused on specialization, I would argue we need more generalists. Recent best-selling books have also made this case. Evolutionary biologists Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying, in their 2021 book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, say that as our world becomes increasingly complex, the need for generalists grows. We need people who know things across domains and who can make connections between them. Indeed, the recent case for a shift back to a generalist perspective was made by a group of Chinese scholars who called for a reunification of geography focused on the region. The region, they contend, is the only plausible conceptual or analytical hardcore that could reunite the scattered subdisciplinary pieces of a broken disciplinary bottle. At stake is the urgency to reassert the importance of thick regional geographical knowledge in the face of thin universal theorizing about world affairs. Over 4 decades ago, John Fraser Hart called on geographers to produce good regional geography, evocative descriptions that facilitate an understanding and an appreciation of places, areas, and regions. This quest has brought us all here together in Sioux Falls. While many people see regional geography and even history as dead ends, where we travel at our own risk, they are 2 of the most important avenues by which we understand and appreciate the people and places we study. Historical geographer Don Meinig once wrote, "Regions are best understood as dynamic processes, part of a continuous shaping of human culture. Geography and history are bound together by the very nature of things. History takes place, and places are created by history." The Midwest is arguably our country's most diverse region, a social scientist's dream. It's home to America's 3rd largest city, as well as its smallest incorporated town, and everything in between. Its natural and environmental landscapes are some of the most wide-ranging of the continent, as are its economic activities and its cultural composition. For these reasons and others, many of you will be telling us about today, the Midwest absolutely deserves continued study and attention, and it's work that can best be done by historians, geographers, and others who utilize the fundamentals of the regional framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. I love the photo of John Fraser Hart out in the countryside in his bow tie with his pipe surveying the landscape. I went to visit him once at his office at University of Minnesota. I think he taught intro to geography for 65 years or something. He was in his 90s when I went to visit him, but took his briefcase and marched off to class every day to teach geography to young U of M students. Our next speaker is Douglas Powell, who was born in East Tennessee and ultimately landed in Chicagoland, where he is a professor of American literature, writing and rhetoric, and cultural studies at Columbia College, Chicago. He is well known to many of us for his book titled Critical Regionalism, Connecting Politics and Culture in the American Landscape, which came out in 2007. And it's a study of place and region making with a special attention to Johnson City, Tennessee. He is now studying one of my great interests, and that is the area known as Forgotonia. If you've never heard of Forgotonia, this is east central Illinois, this place that kind of escapes everyone's notice. So I look forward to that book down the road. Please welcome Doug.
So I would certainly like to begin by thanking John and for all of those who've worked to make this meeting happen. And I'm honored to be included in this discussion of the new Midwest history. I'm also a little surprised, if I may be candid, since I'm not a historian or a native Midwesterner, and I don't do Midwest studies in any formal way. My writing and professional circles have tended to revolve around Appalachian studies. But I have done some work, as John noted, about regionalism and the concept of region that has reached a wider readership. And in it, I call for more interaction among the various relatively siloed regionalisms. So check. And I hope that there is some interesting perspective in approaching the subject of the Midwest as an exercise in comparative regionalism, which is something else I say in critical regionalism, that all regionalism is comparative. So again, check. Okay, then there is the second half of my title, how am I doing on time, which is the problem of mass culture. Now, if you ask an Appalachianist about the problem of mass culture, the answer looks pretty much like this. However you feel about J.D. Vance and or Hillbilly Elegy, personally I always say I didn't particularly care for it when it was called Hunger of Memory, you perhaps can see how it's a problem when 60 years of work on the varieties of experience in the Appalachian Mountains gets so positively steamrolled by a deeply contentious and I would say idiosyncratic version of the region that we have long studied. It's an all too literal example of what Chimamanda Adichie refers to as the danger of a single story in action. And, you know, the consequences aren't just reputational in a culture that will invest, as we see here, more in the dominant narrative of a region in crisis than in the crises actually facing the region. Appalachian studies, I think, deserve some recognition in responding to the problem of mass culture by, in part, becoming an incubator of projects that have tried to expand the discussion and introduce more of what we've learned about Appalachia, a region which we like to say about which more is known that is not true than any place on earth. And just a couple of these projects, Hillbilly, a documentary that was made by Ashley York and Sally Rubin, what you are getting wrong about Appalachia, the pugnacious title, a real direct response to J.D. Vance by Elizabeth Cady. The Appalachian Reckoning, which is an edited collection that's very diverse in medium and genre, that is trying to enact the idea that there is more voices to be heard from about the region than exists. Dope Sick, the Hulu series about the opioid crisis. All of these were workshopped at various times at the Appalachian Studies Association meeting. And all of them, I would say, outperformed expectations and charted some real successes in expanding the discussion. But let's face it, I believe JD can definitely make a case that he has left a bigger mark on the public consciousness and the public discussion when all is said and done. But that is at least partly because this is not just about the power of a single story, but also about the power of mass culture's single definition of importance. The bigger, the better. And that, to me, is one of the crucial things about regionalism, that it poses a challenge to the assumption that size of your audience, of your units moved, of your clicks, of your eyeballs, of your geographical reach is all that matters. And the assumption, therefore, that regional will always be a low-key bit of a slur. And this preterite status is one of the areas where the Midwest and Appalachia share a common kind of identity and history, though they vary considerably in the particulars. And this is just sort of me brainstorming about the comparison and contrast. Basically, it boils down to the contrast between an essentially deviant region, at least in the public imagination, and an essentially normative one, almost like two axes. Appalachia's reputation for being out of alignment with the body politic, and to a great extent traces back to the post-Civil War period in the late 19th century, when travel writers variously described the place as a strange land and a peculiar people, or, on the other extreme, our contemporary ancestors in the southern mountains. Perhaps it was a problem for a country trying to reunite in the wake of the Civil War, or perhaps a resource for a country trying to preserve its character in the face of waves of Eastern and Southern European migration, or perhaps a rationale for creating a resource extraction sacrifice zone in a rapidly industrializing society. The noble mountaineer who will sacrifice for his country, or the depraved hillbilly who deserves to be sacrificed, are kind of evil twins in a way. Midwest culture representations feature a similar sort of doubling tactic, but along different lines. In the words of Andy Oler, the Midwest holds two conflicting positions in the American cultural imagination, both of which rob the region of cultural distinctiveness. Often it is the heartland standing in for all of American culture. Alternately, the Midwest is flyover country, part of the great undifferentiated mass between the coasts. The character of the place then either affirms or fulfills dominant cultural values, or in the case of, say, a Sinclair Lewis or an Edgar Lee Masters, affirms or fulfills their essential hypocrisy. These stereotypes are remarkable not only for their influence on the viewpoints of people outside their respective regions, but also, I think, for the way that the residents of the regions themselves have internalized this collective identity, this idea that, like, the important things are something that happened someplace else. I'm speaking to you today as an Appalachianist who was born and raised in East Tennessee, but also as a person who has lived the last 20 years in Chicagoland. What's more, I married into a Green Bay family, and so I'm, if not Midwestern, Midwest adjacent for sure. My father-in-law's people were Southern Illinois Germans from the Freeburg area, and so he spent a lot of time on I-55 going back and forth. And one of his favorite observations was, when the good Lord made Central Illinois, he was out of ideas. He was, of course, participating in the rhetorical tradition of what Adam O'Shaughnessy describes as configuring the Midwest as a geographic and cultural void that is utterly unremarkable. To some degree, then the region may represent whatever observers want it to represent. In this way, the Midwest's ill-defined identity situates it as a contested space on which you can project the values that you are trying to promote or perhaps negate. In other words, even a blank slate can be more complex than it initially seems. The patina of uniformity can run cover for a lot of complicated things going on beneath the surface. Or in the words of lit scholar Rebecca Harding, there never was such a thing as an empty space on the American continent. The places designated as empty are in reality culturally distinctive sites full of human and non-human cultural and natural traces. However, these traces have been ignored or effaced. Emptiness is always the product of human decisions. If the problem of mass culture vis-a-vis the Midwest is the creation of an image of stultifying emptiness, then the answer might be, as Harding suggests, to look, quote, under the sign of the empty, to start building connections, as I suggest in critical regionalism, with the very things that promote the idea of a place disconnected from the vital impulses and events of public life. So if we zoom in on this blank space in central Illinois a little more, we could start to see some of the crazing, as potters say, on that undifferentiated finish. There's certainly some evidence to confirm that this space is just as Midwestern can be. Both of the locales, for example, that Edgar Lee Masters wrote about, signified by his stamp there, are on this map. There are a lot of references throughout this subregion to that classic Illinois combo, Abraham Lincoln and Al Capone, the two sides, right, of the Midwestern identity, as Lincoln spent some formative years in the town of New Salem, just outside of Edgar Lee Masters' Petersburg, and Al Capone spent a lot of time on the river coordinating bootlegging and the vice trade. But as that last bit of trivia implies, there's a lot more going on here than just good old small town USA. In this blank space, we saw in the pre-air travel era a thriving tourist trade around hunting and fishing and relaxing by the waters in the river valley. Local people served as proprietors and guides and also as market hunters. There's a market hunter's houseboat there, supplying wild game to fancy restaurants in St. Louis and in Chicago. In this, they probably had more in common than they knew with their indigenous predecessors who had long found the intersection of the Spoon and the Illinois River, which you see there near Havana, as an exceptionally fecund and productive place for hunting and fishing and agriculture, so much so that the archaeologists use the term Havana Hopewell to describe this as a center of the Mississippian civilization, and the ceremonial mounds, of course, still linger in the vernacular landscape. And if you cross the river over into Fulton County in the northwest part of this map, to the surprise of this Appalachianist anyway, you find an area that is today struggling with the transition out of being a coal-producing economy and dealing with the ecological and economic legacy that disappearance of surface mining leaves in its wake. And perhaps the most surprising to the curious critical regionalist on the far western side of my map, you find a unusual homegrown experiment in exactly what we're talking about here today, problematizing the rhetoric of emptiness and disconnection. It's an odd historical footnote that the 16-county region to the west of the Illinois River once seceded from the United States under the name Forgotonia, which they called the land of little return on your tax dollars. Conceived by a couple of local residents and Chamber of Commerce booster types, the project really took off when, in 1971, they recruited a local gadfly and Vietnam veteran and erstwhile Western Illinois University theater major Neil Gamm to become the president of Forgotonia, which he performed with real zeal. Then, pushing back on mass culture by taking a page from the film The Mouse That Roared, they announced their plan was to declare war on the United States and immediately surrender, sitting back and waiting for their Marshall Plan to kick in. The official state bird was the albatross, and the flower, the forget-me-not. A series of press releases and photo ops by Gamm at the nation's new capital in the crossroads of Fandon actually led to national media coverage of this upstart movement, calling attention to the way that this area had been left out of transportation infrastructure mass planning as passenger rail had ended and no interstates had ever arrived. Neil Gamm found himself testifying to Congress, and before much time had passed, Amtrak service was restored to Quincy, and new plans for highway construction and improvement had been approved that are still being enacted today. Despite the advice he got from an Illinois congressman who said, perhaps instead of seceding from the United States, you should simply join Cook County. Beyond these short-term achievements, the whole notion of Forgotonia has had a long-term legacy for political discourse in the state of Illinois, where every statewide election year, politicians rediscover their forgotten loyalty to Forgotonia. And for local commerce, where Forgotonia Brewing, as you see in the upper left-hand corner there, is the linchpin of a whole regional branding project, which has revived and is trying to reappropriate this name, Unforgettable Forgotonia. And of course, there is the permanent now sign noting the Neil Gamm Veterans Memorial Freeway, which runs right through the middle of downtown Fandon, Illinois. What this experiment revealed was that under the sign of the empty was energy, creativity, humor, and real structural and financial issues to be solved. Gamm and company found their way to make the very terms of their invisibility visible. And it makes you wonder what other unexpected nodes of interconnection this presumptive blankness might conceal. Let me leave you with one last example, zooming in on this map just a little bit more. Right up above Al Capone's head there, you can see a great big lake. That's Thompson Lake. And it's a curious feature on this map because if you looked at a map that was from about, 50 or 60 years after this one, Thompson Lake would be gone. In 1924, it would be blank, right? A blank spot on the map. Drained in 1924 and converted into a 6,000 hectare agricultural production facility, or farm, the largest in Illinois. But in the year 2000, the Nature Conservancy acquired this property and began a long and patient process of wetlands restoration, which not only remediated the landscape to its previous state, returning Thompson Lake to the map, but also introduced new technology, which we see on the bottom left there, to turn the lake into a sophisticated 21st century water purification project. I'm pleased to say that this year, 25 years after it began, the floodgates on the downstream end of the lake were opened and Thompson Lake began returning clean water, carefully monitored, free of invasive species, to the mainstream of the Illinois. Somewhat ironically, the process of returning the landscape to its earlier condition is also a tangible achievement for forward thinking, contributing to a healthier future, not just for Forgatonia and the Midwest, but for all who live downstream. And as our watershed regionalist colleagues in eco-criticism teach us, that's everybody. But they've done so while honoring regional historical and cultural traditions and practices surrounding river life. It's available for hunting and fishing and as a local public recreational source. And also world-class birding on the Mississippi Flyway. So to conclude, I would just like to say, if mass culture is the problem, then maybe this looks something like the solution, a kind of allegory for what a robust regional studies can do, to revise the region, facilitating the kind of cultural and material changes that make the resources of its past more available to the people who live there, to help create the conditions for a region that contributes positively, just like the once and future Thompson Lake, to everything downstream, which is all of us.
Questions? Well, hopefully you can hear me. This will probably turn on in a minute. Hopefully some of you have a couple questions. There are microphones on the right and left side of the theater. Just go up there and ask your question. I was going to note that in the last issue of Middle West Review, we published an article by I think a political scientist from Illinois who has been tracking this continuing movement in Illinois of counties in western Illinois to secede from the state and join Indiana or Iowa. I don't know if you've seen this.
I have.
And there's been and there was actually a meeting in Indiana in the capital about how do we absorb these other counties from Illinois. So that's kind of a fun story to follow. But the fact that no one's really heard about this movement, secessionist movement, kind of speaks to the flyover conditions or the invisibility that you talked about. I also wanted to say, Doug, make sure you bring some of that Forgatonia brewing beer next year when we have this meeting.
I think Macomb would actually be a wonderful location for a future gathering, actually.
Oh, perfect.
It's true.
All right. We have a question from Lee.
Thank you. Is this one on? No. Should I do something with it? Is it working now? Or not? Okay. Okay, thank you. Really, I learned a lot. Really interesting presentations, and I was hoping to maybe try and put Jeff and Chris in conversation just a moment, because I saw maybe a juxtaposition between the two presentations. So Jeff, as you acknowledged, pretty dour, with some silver linings, right? And you gave some explanations for it as well, right? So there's lots of multi-causal, lots of explanations. One point that you had raised, among many others, was the rise in computer science degrees, and then maybe there's a correlation, causation. People are choosing one over the other, maybe for perceived economic opportunity. I also, and this is where I wanted to see if you and Chris could be in conversation, where looking at the polling data of Americans' perspective on higher education, Americans, lots of causes, lots of reasons, but Americans have become very skeptical of higher education, increasingly so over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I wanted to see if perhaps one of maybe Chris's description of geography, and I don't mean just focused on Jeff, but I mean also for Chris to comment as well. If part of the reason for the skepticism is in what Chris is identifying, and if so, and first I'd like to see whether you think that's the case for the decline in history majors, and then in the history profession more generally, and then if Chris has any comments in that conversation. Thank you. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm sure if I don't answer it, you'll hopefully give me a follow-up.
Jeff, pull the mic in a little bit.
Oh, okay. Thank you, John. In terms of what we do as historians, the Midwest has never been of great interest. So I don't think the decline in geography programs or the decline in interest in the Midwest itself has affected too much the historical profession. What has influenced the historical profession and a number of history majors is the idea that, first of all, students need a significant return on their college investment. And they may be able to do that in economics or computer science or something else. I train social studies teachers, and my average teacher might start making 45, 50, if you're lucky, 55,000 a year. But if you can make twice that much money in computer science and you're $40,000 or $50,000 in debt, well, then you should probably do the major, which will make you more money. And so I'll leave it at that. Chris, do you want my comment, or Kristan?
I guess maybe my question was too ambiguous. It was there's clearly evidence of rising public skepticism of Americans of all different backgrounds of higher education. Chris may have identified one additional reason, which is the perception, at least, of a distraction away from offering the history that, as you acknowledged, Jeff, Americans love, and being diverted towards other goals that Chris's remarks near the end exemplified. That was the question.
Okay. Chris, do you want to give that a shot?
It's a little difficult to assess in geography because very few students out of high school come to university for geography. I'm lucky if I have one geography major in a big 60 or 70 lecture intro gen ed type of course. It's a discovery discipline. It's where I found geography. It's where all of the people that I've associated with over the years, they found it along the way. So, which is a good thing because typically when we do get majors, we don't lose them. They didn't come to, major in geography and hate it and go somewhere else. They usually came to major in business or biology, and then they find geography and figure out what it's all about. So it's hard to measure that sentiment as far as people's thoughts about higher ed and geography. Also, geography is very embedded within other programs. So the GIS, the computer mapping things that I was mentioning, a lot of biology departments or natural resources programs have that within it. So then they really never even consider becoming a geography major. And that's where a lot of the jobs are today too.
History also has been tied up in our political culture wars. And historians can often be tarred as communists or leftists or someone who criticizes their country because of the research they do. And I never had a class from a communist historian. I don't work with any, but politics can interfere with students making choices that maybe they would want to about their career. John.
Kristan, you want to jump in before we take the next question?
Yeah, I agree with you all that at least at my university, not only are the students looking for the bang for their buck, but that's how we as faculty and departments are assessed, is the return on investment for our students. And I totally agree. Again, our students find me. They don't come in wanting to do interdisciplinary geographic related work. And I think, yeah, the politicization, I joke that I'm a really bad academic because I'm not nearly as liberal as most of my colleagues. Some of that's, I think, because I grew up in the Midwest. But I do think that from the outside, I'm going to come back to my talk, it's that people don't know what we do. They have no idea what professors do. And at least in my state, that then gets translated into, yeah, you just sit around all day and think big thoughts and get paid a lot of money, neither of which is accurate. So I think we have a serious social issue in helping people understand why universities writ large are important, and then within universities, why various disciplines are so important.
Aaron?
Thank you both. I'm a historian, and your follow-up explanations have brought up an idea that I'm wrestling with here. Part of the explanation that I'm seeing from our historians is that the history of field is declining because of a pragmatic cause. We just aren't getting the bang for the buck. But I'm also seeing a theme throughout a lot of the discussions about simply a decline in liberal arts, just general, liberal arts as an intrinsically valuable study, as demonstrated by this lack of the bang for the buck. But I think maybe there might be something that's a little bit bigger, and this is where I'm going to talk to Chris directly. So I have had a prejudice against geographers, and this is terrible because I'm a historian, right? I should really love geography, especially regional geography. But the prejudice comes from my son when he's taking these geography classes, and it seemed like the whole emphasis of these classes was on this DEI, the depopulation, the fact that there's a fear of population explosion. And so I think maybe whoever came up here first, one of the commonalities between this decline of the geography and the decline of the history, maybe not so much about the practical bang for the buck argument, but it could be the fact that the interpretive model that we're using is this dialectical model. I understand that we don't have communist professors, but actually almost everybody in my department is based off of a sort of cultural dialectic, which is not that far removed from the Marxist argument, the idea that it's all about conflict. And so then our students hesitate to go into a classroom where they feel like they are part of the oppressor or the oppressive class. And so they are avoiding the liberal arts because of the high-level politicization. And you guys just followed up with politicization has been a stumbling block. So the question I'm really asking is, isn't that politicization a reflection of the interpretive model that really is dominant in almost all the fields of liberal arts, which is the dialectical model? It's a conflict base. We're always looking at conflict, rather than the old idea, and I know people hate this word, but more of a progressive model where there is a understanding of development that is not necessarily born out of conflict, but maybe just simply a natural development. Do you think that that model is responsible for the politicization, which is then in turn responsible for decline of both of the fields, I would say, of geography? And that, again, exposes my prejudice for what I've been seeing with geography.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it. Thankfully, I'm at a fairly small regional university where we stick to the fundamentals more or less. It is one of the reasons, though, why I did end up, as I mentioned in the talk, myself and many others have left the professional organization that I once belonged to, because you'd go to these meetings and that's what 90% of what you heard was about. And like I said, the geography's kind of missing. I have no problem with people talking about those sorts of topics, but unless you're grounding them in the fundamentals of what the discipline is actually about, then that's kind of where I do start to have a problem with it. Anybody else?
Kristan?
Yeah, I agree that I think it's sad that it's becoming harder and harder to lay out what I tell my students are really just sort of the facts, quotes, because you're constantly on edge about how any progressive conversation is going to be interpreted, not just by the students, but by my colleagues. And yeah, it's a struggle. And again, I'm in Appalachia. We have some really interesting dynamics. and I think, again, back to my previous comment, I think this is all tied. It's all of a piece with the shift from higher education being the place where you go to explore, whether it's the progressive or the conflict or whatever model you choose, to an expectation that somehow everyone should align with what you already think. And I think we've just lost, as academics, I think we have lost our way, we're partially to blame, and again, just broader society, because they get all their history from ice road truckers.
Any other questions? Christy?
Thank you. Well, okay. Thank you so. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Kristan Abhen-Warren. I'm at University of Iowa. So glad to see an Iowa representative here, reps here. I'm just really curious. I'm an admin, but I'm also faculty, so I'm kind of this hybrid. We've noticed at the University of Iowa, since we had the shift from sort of the butts and seats model, just enrollment, right? Because as we know, a lot of the liberal arts classes were part of the gen ed curriculum. So it seems like for a long time, the classes that we offered, in my case, religious studies, history, American studies, what have you, departments were doing well, they were getting lines, but once there was that shift to the number of majors, there seems to be, a real, more than a coincidence, but actually a causal negative relationship with how the departments were perceived. And that's when we started, so when we had the shift from the butts and seats, if you will, enrollment to how many majors, religious studies is also a found major, history is also a found major, although I will say my senior at Iowa, he is a history major, so there we go. So I'm just really curious, what have you seen at your institutions? Have you noticed a correlation between that shift, metric shift between sort of how your departments are doing and the number of majors? Just curious. Thanks.
Oh, I guess I get to go. The history department at Iowa State suffers from the fact that you don't have to take any history courses to graduate from Iowa State. You can take a humanities course, and that humanities can fall in one of many different places. And some colleges, College of Ag, College of Business, they want to make sure their majors, that their students stay in their college and spend money in their college, so they will offer a humanities course taught there. So students get less and less of a broad liberal arts education as colleges or universities or departments compete very strenuously for those majors. I teach a business history class. It's new. I put it together to attract business majors. Business majors don't take it. I end up with a bunch of history majors. So that's part of the problem, is competition.